Good evening, everyone. It's really great to see you all. I'm Daniela Theinová from the Center for Irish Studies at the Faculty of Arts, Charles University, and it's a huge privilege for us to be hosting this event, and we are grateful to Culture Ireland, the Arts Council and the EFACIS for supporting the event. We are grateful to Georgina Nugent-Folan for sharing Eileen with us while she's on her miniature grand tour of Central Europe. And we are also grateful to the Department of Foreign Affairs Ireland and the Irish Embassy in Prague for their long-term support. And to Kavarna na Borshovie for their hospitality and letting us use this beautiful space. It is my great pleasure and honour, indeed, to be able to introduce Eiléan Ní Chuilleanáin, one of Ireland's foremost poets. Eiléan, whose career spans more than 50 years, writes in English. She's also fluent in Irish. She occasionally writes in Irish. She's maybe going to read as a poem in Irish, from which and from several other languages she has translated. And indeed, one of her great contributions has been an effective merging of Ireland's two major linguistic and poetic traditions, the Gaelic one and the Anglophone one, in her poetry as well as in her work as a critic and scholar. But although her poetry is firmly rooted in the Irish cultural heritage and the mixture of styles and influences and outlooks that make up modern Ireland, it is also always drawn on a shared intercultural and essentially transnational space and tradition. Ní Chuilleanáin is a professor emerita of Trinity College Dublin, where she taught for many years in the School of English, specializing in Renaissance studies. Between 2016 and 2019, she served as Ireland Professor of Poetry, having been preceded in this prestigious role or position by Paula Meehan, and her successors have been Frank Ormsby and most recently Paul Muldoon. Ní Chuilleanáin is the recipient of many prizes, including the Patrick Kavanagh Award and the International Griffin Poetry Prize, and her latest collection, The Map of the World, published in 2023, is her second book to have been shortlisted for T.S. Eliot Prize. Together with three other poets, including her late husband, McDara Woods, Ní Chuilleanáin co-founded the literary magazine Cyphers in 1975, one of the longest undertaking of this kind in the scene, which has recently published its 95th issue and whose ethos has been to bring out the best and most exciting poetry and prose from Ireland as well as from other languages and traditions. She is one of the powerful, brilliant Irish women poets who accessed the scene in the course of the 1970s and 1980s. From early on, with collections such as Acts and Monuments, Brazen Serpent, The Second Voyage, Ní Chuilleanáin has been changing the face of Irish poetry by pointing up the blanks and absences in the Irish past and literary tradition, which have been the result of a systemic suppression of certain voices. But whether these omissions point to the silencing of female experiences or voices of other marginalized groups, even languages, her poetry does not seek to redress those injustices and imbalances by filling absences with words and content. Ní Chuilleanáin's use of language is not so much about moving forward. Rather, it is about inviting us to take a pause and to ask with her over and again, and I quote, "Is this real? Do I really believe this? Do I really feel this?" The kind of question that, as she claims, cannot be answered except by trying again in a poem. End of quote. Maybe the greatest fascination of this poetry lies in the readiness of its voice to fail us, and to see its failure as the opportunity for a new beginning rather than a resolution. Nicholas Allen writes that for Ní Chuilleanáin, quote, "the realization of the limits of language is a first step to freedom," end quote. We could say that Ní Chuilleanáin's coded, at points, willfully esoteric poetic idiom not only verges on silence, but enacts historical silences. Above all, however, it is a token of desire and poetic inspiration. In an interview, she recalls how, in the early years of her career, people used to think that she was a kind of male impersonator and not a woman poet at all, because I was not writing about gynecology and I was not writing about domestic matters. I was writing more out of my imagination. Indeed, she may not have been writing about domestic matters, but elements of architecture, portals, towers, ruins, and walls have provided many striking and surprisingly eloquent images. And the same goes for natural spaces and imagery that are at the heart of some of her most powerful poems. Of course, nature, or what we nowadays self-consciously refer to as the non-human or the other than human sphere of existence, remains one of the biggest mysteries. According to Eiléan Ní Chuilleanáin, and I quote, "We don't know about nature when it's on its own. It's when the fisherman, or the artist, or the pilgrim confronts nature that language emerges. We have to say something about it," end quote. Accordingly, Ní Chuilleanáin's landscapes, seascapes, rocks, or trees are never on their own, but always accompanied by a human figure and consciousness. And yet, despite their silence and their apparent fixedness in time and place, these mountains, waters, valleys, and woods are witnesses in their own right. In their specific temporality, their inherent biological or geological structures, they are capable of recollection, or they allow for recollection to take place. Their role, it seems, is to help us realize that we, just as them, are in fact made of histories layered upon histories that are nonetheless present as well as being in the past. In Ní Chuilleanáin's poems, we are invited into history as well as to partake in geological time, in sea time or tree time, which is of course different from our sense of time. It is a time in which things may happen, or in which perhaps nothing happens. It is in this respect as well that her poetry has been timeless. It is my huge privilege and pleasure indeed to give you Eiléan Ní Chuilleanáin.
Thank you very much for that very eloquent and penetrating introduction. I will have to think about some of the things in it, but then that's all right too. I'm going to start with a poem called The Miracles, because here we are in Central Europe, where architecture tells us in extraordinary ways about the lives of people. Architecture not just as something built, but also as offering a home to sentiment and preoccupation and anxiety. This poem is called The Miracles, and it's dedicated to my sister-in-law, Shievra Woods, and her mate, Antonio Piacenza, who brought myself and Magdara to a church in Mantova and said, go in, wait a while, and then look up. And when we looked up, we saw these extraordinary images which had been made by people whose absolutely dreadful fates had been somehow or other avoided by the intervention of the Virgin Mary. And they had in gratitude made images of what it was like to be just on the point of being dropped down a well, or hung, or a man standing by with a very large hammer to hit you on the head, and for it not to happen. I was, of course, gobsmacked by this. We were gobsmacked by this. But also, I was suddenly aware that this is what we haven't been able to do in Ireland, because what we have in Ireland out of the architectural past, a lot of it is ruins. A lot of it is spaces which once were full of some kind of important life and now are noticeably empty. So that's what the poem says. The miracles. Coming out of a country where emptied houses lay open to the weather, sheep in the entry, weedy graveyards, the foxes cry at night their only music, the bridge, the shifting planks, greased with the season's flattened leaves as frost loosens its grasp. Then on the far side, withered grass trampled, the briar hedge where ice lingered underneath. I could not have made it up. How in the tall church, beside the wide, calm river, a short walk from the city walls, the poor, whose luck once seemed to have definitely run out, had made from wooden spars and their own old clothes the image of deliverance, the moment when the Virgin interfered, just as the torturer was ready to start work. Or the rope broke, the reprieve made it across the slippery bridge in time, even though the clock had been put forward so it would come too late. Thronging the walls, these puppets of misfortune, not the natural kind, like a mad bull or a robber or evil spirits. Instead, the tall tree of human revenge, dressed up to look like justice, instantly bending its branches, loaded with mercy like fruit. Look at their faces, they can't believe it's true. But their truth holds out, as when they manufactured it themselves. The scenes of distress, their crash and agony, changed into carpentry and the needle's deliberate work. It's the same rough craft that made the sod cabin to defy the writ of eviction, the same bridge spanning the gully, fear which is everywhere pushed back, and those truths that were nearly told at the wrong moment were able to wait. Just as tonight, the parent climbing the stairs after 3 warnings feels the brush of her sleeve, swallows back the word that can't be recalled if spoken, and goes quietly down again. That's the first poem from a collection called The Map of the World. And I thought of The Map of the World as the name of a tune, because Irish traditional tunes have sometimes very interesting names, like The Cat That Ate the Candle or The Ravelled Hank of Yarn. So there could be a tune called The Map of the World. And the reason why I was thinking of the title of a tune was that I was asked to write a poem in memory of the musician Mícheál Ó Súilleanáin, and this is it. So it's called Air, the Map of the World. The map had told us already what would happen to the peoples of the West. Long promontories hurrying them out into the salty ocean fields. Roads that twisted around inlets, constantly promising a place to rest. And yet invention does not falter. Just feel the tailor's clutch of the variously woven tweeds, ready for the scissors, the tacking, the silky lining. Listen, as the echoes are twisting into a macaronic language, listen to the places we came from, their stories elbowing each other out of the way. Can you recall the dripping walls of the library, the lads who were thought to be studying grammar to prepare for Maynooth, but instead they were planning their forays across the plains of Argentina? Up comes the prophecy I heard in the train, making the slow journey from Fishguard as far as the junction, when the big woman with red hair in the green and white dress with a gold belt and red shoes told us over and over, they don't come back from America, they comes back from England, not America, they never comes back. And along the carriage a man was playing an accordion. The cards were slapped down on suitcases. Do we not know about those journeys now, or how the accordion's long note spoke up in agreement, so that I could never have recalled her voice except for that music, its delays and provisos, dividing up the time. I'm going to read some older poems and then get back to this new book, The Map of the World. This one is called Studying the Language. I am, of course, very aware here of the opacity of language, of listening to a language where you really know only 3 words, and those words aren't the ones you're hearing. At one time in my life, I used to visit on a Saturday afternoon one person who was immobilized after a stroke, another person who was immobilized from alcoholism, and I thought I would write a poem called Visiting the Prisoners, and it didn't get anywhere. And then one day I suddenly thought of the way in which you listen to a language when you're trying to learn it. And in particular, because all the languages I know apart from English and Irish are Romance languages, where one of the things that you hear is gender. So studying the language. On Sundays, I watch the hermits coming out of their holes into the light. Their cliff is as full as a hive. They crowd together on warm shoulders of rock where the sun has been shining. Their joints crackle. They begin to talk after a while. I listen to their accents. They're not all from this island, not all old, not even, I think, all masculine. They're so wise, they do not pretend to see me. They drink from the scattered pools of melted snow. I walk right by them and drink when they have done. I can see the marks of chains around their feet. I call this my work, these decades and stations, because without these, I would be a stranger here. I'm going to read a poem called The Morandi Bridge, Il Ponte Morandi. In Genova, there was a wonderful overpass. It was a triumph of Italian engineering, and for years and years, with my husband and sometimes with our son, we'd drive along it and think how safe it was. And then in the year 2018, which was the year that my husband died, it fell down. It fell down not because it was badly built, but because it was badly maintained. And it's one of the things that happens when somebody dies. You realize you want to tell them what has happened, and you can't. So the poem is partly about him, but it is really about the bridge. Morandi was the architect, or the engineer. They reopened it in the middle of 2020, triumphantly, in spite of COVID and everything else. So it has reappeared, but I haven't driven over it since. Let me lean my cheek against this limestone pillar. I want to press until I feel the buzzing, the sound the world makes when it isn't going anywhere, a purr of grey, transparent wings hovering in one place, a humming to itself because it needs to lie still, stay quiet, and recover, and who will bring help? The noise when the bridge fell down in Genova, the road you and I drove along slowly, heading east, behind a small Fiat, packed and weighed down with people, cake and flowers for a mother-in-law who made a Sunday lunch. They were taking their time. It was lunchtime again each year when we reached the bridge, and the families were always on the move. So we'd drive along slowly those 15 minutes, high up over the factories and streets. I would tell you this news if the stones of the world could carry language, but after 8 months, the shock and the noise inside them still, they cannot move or even allow a message to pass through. Well, I've been talking about, Daniela talked about architecture, and there is a lot of architecture in my poems. This one, though, is about the meeting between architecture and music. It's called the percussion version. Music is why we live inside these 4 square rooms, why we gather to listen to the scrabbling and the sound test, the way the splash cymbal explores the limits, vibrating against the glass, and the bell note rings and rises like a cloud into the ceiling. From outside the house, how different. I paused beside the door, and all I could hear was a chair scraping into silence, and presently a soft step climbing, a sigh from the upper floor, at which, in the room below, something knocked just once, and the well in the backyard answered with a bass vibrating groan. I'll go back to the map of the world to talk a bit about I suppose a title for this poem could be The Oral Tradition. This is my post-COVID poem. I caught COVID at the big party in Dublin Castle during the Joyce Conference of 2022, not looking at anybody present. When I had recovered somewhat, I tried to brush my hair, which is, for me, is always an important moment. And I found it exhausting. And I remembered something which my grandmother must have known, and she must have told my mother, but it was my mother who told me, about a woman called Muriel Gifford. Muriel Gifford would have been my grandmother's sister-in-law's sister, but they were close. And what she told me, what my mother told me, was that when Muriel had a fever, which, like the one I had just recovered from, they wanted to cut her hair off, and her husband wouldn't allow it, and he combed her hair very slowly and gently using the tip of the comb, and that's something I've sort of known ever since. It came back to me on this occasion, so I wrote a poem called Muriel Gifford after her fever. I should explain, she was married to the poet and revolutionary Tomás MacDonagh. He was executed in 1916, and she was drowned a year later. So that generation of the family was wiped out. Fluttering, coiling, a strand of hair, a phrase, a tune remembered, not named. Is it called fever? The weariness that comes after fever, even too weak to brush my hair. The mass of tangles at my neck, like the leaves blown into a corner, piled by a feverish wind. The long strand of memory, twisted and blended, entwines around my hand, holding the brush, and the story my grandmother knew catches. My mother told me she gave her the way to untwist the long tangled locks of hair. In those days, they cut your hair off if you'd had a fever, but Muriel's hair was lovely. Her husband prevented them cutting. He sat beside her and used the tip of the comb, carefully combing all the way down, slowly stroking every long hair free until she could wind it again, twisted in plaits and piled up as she chose. When I finish my hair, I'm too weak to begin the day, putting on your heavy carved ring with its dark green stone, and my mother's ring on the other finger. My hand feels light, something swept away as they were swept by the firing squad and the stifling, coiling wave. Speaking of Joyce and that event in Dublin Castle, I was inveigled into writing a poem for that event called, it was supposed to have a Joycean theme, and it's called Sirens. It's based on the moment in Ulysses when Leopold Bloom goes into a bar and then realizes that his wife's lover is there, and therefore moves into the room next door to have lunch, but can hear the music, the singing coming through. So that's it's about, again, music heard from another room. There's a reference to it also, of course, to a cat jumping, partly perhaps related to a picture by Nano Reid called Cat on Barrel. But the barrel tone bass is actually not from the barrel in Nano Reid. It's from what Molly Bloom says when she's laughing and laughing at the figure cut by a man who has borrowed a pair of trousers which are too small for him. And she talks about his barrel tone bass notes. So, Sirens. Nothing can be compared to anything else. Was that a shadow, the shadow of a bird? The notes dissolved in air as if it were water. And yes, it has happened again. Proportion gone, perspective abolished, those vibrating walls. And within, he waits for the shock to dissipate, slowly as the room allows the present quarter its share of time to pass. Down there in the cellar, confirming the worst, the cat lands on the keyboard, hitting all the barrel tone bass notes together. Silence, and then she deftly trots all the way along the white keys, only to pause where the single high note expected to finish. So she waits for him. He reaches out his hand, nailing the chord, the one surviving law. I'm going to read a poem called Let Me Explain. A few years ago, I had a student who was determined to write about Joyce and Lacan. Now, I have an interest, of course, in Joyce, like any reading Irish person, but I knew absolutely nothing about Lacan, so I did my best to discourage her or to go and find somebody else. It didn't work, and then I thought, well, I'd better find out something about this. I was staying with some friends, and I realized that on their shelves was a book written by a friend of theirs who is a Lacanian analyst, but who also described her own collapse, her own mental collapse, in very understandable terms, so that I started to feel, yes, this is something that I do recognize. It's whatever it is that makes people say things which they know are not on one level true, like they know they're not true, and yet there is something which presses them to say that there are pressures on them which can only result, apparently, in their saying things, and at some level maybe believing things which on another level they know are not true. So I tried to imagine what those pressures might be, and that's why the poem is called Let Me Explain. They had taken my fiddle away from me in the passage. They said, You won't need this for a while. When I insisted, they put it away carefully and brought me in to the kitchen, to the heat. But I knew I needed to get out of that room. The man with his shirt open leered at my aunt breastfeeding, and the boy was there too. I'd been found with him before. His brother smoked at the fireside below the dangling laundry. A goose on the table, half butchered. A small naked dog under a chair. The ladder just next to the stove had been taken away, so I tried the other door, and it led me to the flat roof beside a bedroom window. I swear I never even looked in. I tried the fire escape, ending on a stone terrace, and when I shouted, I could hear the words came in a strange language and said things I knew were false. I kept on, because I knew their conversation was not about what was really on their minds, how their lives would be if I could not be managed, and what, they probably said, did I really need? I kept on calling, afraid that if I stopped for breath, out of breath, I would lose the power of speech forever. Here's a short one. It's called a colophon. And you know what a colophon is. It's the statement at the end of a book which says, printed by Aldo Manuzio in Venice in 1496, or something like that. It's a sign of conclusion. The printer stands upright and stretches his shoulders. The copy in all its length has been rolled up, then pushed aside. Now comes the gathering and binding, and the journey to populate shelves alongside its peers. This happens slowly, unlike the crowding of bees in a swarm, but it's the same rush to be packed together as votes in their urn, as choirs. The libraries, dumb in their long closed weekends, are always attracting paper, plucked from the private offices, uprooted from barrows into the summed catalogues. Now the hand embraces the long-expected volume. In the clutch of paper, the finger holding its place, the margins defaced, the manicule and the asterisk land like wasps. Released from its clasp, the book relaxes. Now, I've been told it's okay if I read one not very long poem in Irish. This one is called Cat Salaba. It's about, it describes something that actually happened, staying with a friend in Italy who has 4 cats, and they're not really allowed into the house, so they have ways and means of getting in. So this one got into my room, and in the middle of the night, she seemed to be combing my hair. And it was as if she was trying to tell me something, because she was really sticking her nose into my ear. Then I had to let her out. And then in the morning I thought, what on earth was all that about? And the answer is, it's poetry. You know, poetry comes at you at times like this. So, Cat Salaba. Cat Carad, agus méar cuairtchuige. Bhúil si isteach sa seomra, nuair a bhíos chun dul a chulla, agus ligastí fanacht in Achelam, hí tas agus fionóim. Ach dúsíoch mé ag trí a chlog, mar bhí si a círam a bhrúige le na hingine, is ag brúorm a srón beag nach sáite isteach im chluas. Níoríonn si crónán ar bith lean irthaí ag obair chun rud éigean a chur gcuine dom, ag obair in aíire chun go digthing ach heb irthaí bhí an colla róhrám. An son hasnig si a cuine agus bhí orm éirí agus í a scuile amach faoi níthe mé cosnachta ar urlár fuair. Ar maidim bhí úna orm féin rud a hála, ach cén fáin árthaigis pe rud a bhí a gceist. Nach mar sin a bhí an scéal, an ilíocht ag breth oring le graim an uafáis sa dorachadas. Is ag imacht a ríis gan fiú focail amháin agus an dúlagas fáca a cé roing an achtra hiiscint, conas a hála tiomnú cuit a bheith cho Jackar son a bhíniu. I'll do a kind of off-the-cuff translation. I should have wrote a translation, but I will. Okay, a friend's cat, when I was visiting him, came into the room when I was going to sleep, and I allowed her to stay because I wanted her warmth and fur. But I woke at 3 o'clock because she was combing my hair with her nails, with her claws, and pressing on me, her nose almost stuck inside my ear. She there was no purring. She continued working, trying to tell me something, but it wasn't working. She was working for me to understand, but she failed. The sleep was too heavy. And then she started to whine, and I had to get up and let her out in the night, barefoot on a cold floor. In the morning, I was astonished at what had happened, but why didn't I understand what it was? Isn't that how it works? Poetry grabbing us with the grime of horror in the darkness and leaving again without a word, just leaving us the duty of understanding what had happened. How did it happen that a cat's instruction or charge, I suppose, is so difficult to understand? Okay, now I'm going to read a poem which has a background in folklore, or in the study of folklore. There are important and memorable stories that are handed down in the folk tradition, but there are also much smaller stories where sometimes it's in order to tell us that the other story is true. So, for example, the title of this poem is Some Lads Were Walking Home Late After a Dance. When you read that line, or when you hear it, you know that what's happening is not terribly important, but it goes to bolster up a different story. There's an example, for example, there is an example in Yeats's account of traditions surrounding the poet Raftery, which is that when he died, he was alone, but a light was seen in the house where he was dying, and the people said that was the angels waking him. So somebody seeing, some not terribly interesting person, seeing a phenomenon is what this kind of story is about. I've come across this many times, but recently it hit me that the line about some lads coming home after a dance brought me back, of course, immediately to my own youth, and the way one didn't mind a long walk in the cold, late at night, across the city of Cork, after an evening spent enjoying oneself. That feeling which has something to do with youth. So I thought I'd write a poem about it. Some lads were walking home late after a dance. Although I don't know just what happened then, the words are a warning gripping me, alerted as if by the sharpening breeze they felt when, reaching the crest of the low hill, they had a few miles yet to go. The odd sound from afar, the cooling air freshening their wits, the rhythm of walking, the company made the way seem short enough. A shadow, hare or cat, was crossing the road, where it sloped down gently downward from the cross. And what was shown to them there? What words were spoken? Although, since this is a typical episode, I can guess. An encounter, a door opening to an urgent world which needs to speak, which asks for help. One of them was called by his name and given a message to pass on to a neighbour of his own. All three saw, 4 fields away, a light in the ruined house. The story is current still in the place. They never forget that meeting, but remember especially how wide awake, how ready they had felt at midnight outside the dance hall, calling out goodbye before turning together for the road home. So, have I time for, well, maybe 2 more poems? Would that be excessive? Okay. Right. This one is called What Happened Next? And it started from reading a book called Naples 1944, describing the impact on the city of Naples of the end of the Italian participation in the Second World War, and the particularly striking fact of respectable women selling sex to soldiers in public for food. So it makes one wonder, what happens next when something very memorable has happened. So, will we ever be told what happened afterwards to the man who had fallen among thieves as he went down from Jerusalem to Jericho, half killed? What happened to him after the Samaritan paid for his care at the inn? Or what became of the women in Naples in 1944 who sold rough sex to soldiers in public for food, their faces never changing as they took it? How can I even ask? Who would I ask? Indeed, it was never the point of the story. Fiction or truth, it will be told again. This happened in my lifetime in a place that I know. The moment the light falls on the victim, and then it moves away slowly. The light that also falls when there's nobody there to see it. When I begin the telling, the words will not be quiet. I have to lie down beside them and listen to the crackling syllables that keep beginning again each time the wheel of language spins. But they never tell what happened after the ending. They have so many stories, and not all have been heard already, and not all of them can tell us clearly what we ought to have done. Okay. Thank you very much.